Alrighty. Greetings and welcome back. I am pleased today to be joined by the Distributist. Now, I don't know if everyone in my audience knows the Distributist. Obviously, as we upload on both our channels, the Distributist audience knows who the Distributist is. He is definitely a Catholic YouTuber. I'm not sure how I would politically describe you. Are you a
Um,
reactionary?
yeah,
I don't know.
I wouldn't call myself a reactionary because the word's kind of cringe, but
Yeah,
the set of ideas that other than just being Catholic, the set of ideas I'm most commonly associated with are neo-reaction slash Italian elitism, sort of political realism mixed with Catholic theology, as it's often wont to do. Um, and I obviously have some criticisms of the various thinkers in that school, but I believe that they have the right takes. So it's a simpler to say that I'm a reactionary.
fair enough. I didn't want to put words in your mouth. I wasn't really sure how best to describe you. And he has a YouTube channel, which will be linked in the low bar, and he talks about things related to, I guess, reactionary politics, religion slash Catholicism, and
Yeah, it's
occasionally movie critiques as well, as I've noticed on occasion as well. So,
yeah. Sometimes I do sort of the intersection between culture and politics is my thing.
hmm
It's been for
yeah,
the last 5 years. So thank you
yeah,
for having me on. I'm not so sure who's having who on, but I think we're going to be
oh,
talking
it's
about a lot of
welcome.
things. I know I was going to
Yeah,
mention some of your videos, but I think you had some questions for me as well.
Yeah, well, I know you're not. See, this is the first question I had. I know you're not super old like I am, but
Mhm.
or relatively, but you're also not super young. You're in your mid 30s, is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah. So, one question I've been kind of posing to myself for a while, because I'm slowly but surely getting up there, getting close to 50
mm,
in the not too distant future, and is when you're older, there's there's this trap that you might fall into a state of nostalgia, and you might think, well, back then it was better, and sometimes that might be an accurate view, and sometimes it might
mm,
not be, but it's usually sort of way back. So in my case, it would be potentially reminiscing about the 80s or the early 90s,
yeah,
or something like that. But the thing is, can I call you Dave? Is that okay?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. That's everyone calls me Dave.
yeah, yeah. Dave, is that I don't do that. What I do is I reminisce about 2014 to 2015.
Oh no way,
And
really?
well, I do because that just seemed like, and this is what it's not really nostalgia. That's what I'm kind of wondering. I wanted to ask you. I feel, and I've talked to other people about this, that the the change in the last couple of years has been so rapid that when I do think about the good old days, relatively speaking, obviously, I'm not thinking about 40, 30 years ago necessarily, although I could do that. Sometimes I do, but rather
Mhm.
I'm juxtaposing, say, 2022 as we're in right now, with 2015, 2014, maybe 2013, which seem to be the years just prior to the explosion of, I don't really know how to describe it, but all the junk we've been dealing with, as it were. Um, do you have that sense too at all, or do you fall into sort of some nostalgic reverie sometimes, or what's your take on that? Do you have that sense of, 2015 was just much better than
Well,
2022?
2000. I felt like I could kind of see what was happening in 2000. By 2015, 2016, I could see that society was heading towards some kind of metastasizing decline, and it appears we've reached that. And it's always hard to say metastasizing because that implies there's not going to be a turnaround or not going to be a change for the better, and you can never rule that out. But it's very hard to see it turning around in any productive way. And I don't know, by 2015, I was really feeling that this was going to be the case. I guess the only thing I'm disappointed in is that I thought that the sort of well to do professional managerial class elite would catch on a little bit faster, that the systems they had developed for thinking about politics and human survival were inadequate and they would reform those ideas faster. And I guess it's just the pattern of humanity. It looks like very few people are. I mean, they're changing their attitudes, but very, very, very slowly, such that you can't really imagine a turnaround in this class of people probably for another 10 years. in any meaningful sense. And, that just means that we're going to be on this path, going in this direction, regardless of what happens. And,
I
it's not
guess
going to last forever, but.
I definitely can see that perspective. For my own part, I think I latch on to those years just because it seemed like a time where you could still speak your mind, and
Mm,
it seems like a minor thing, but given to what we have today, it doesn't seem that minor. And you didn't have to think too much about what you're saying or how you were saying it or who you were talking about. And I realize obviously it was all sort of leading up to the quote unquote current year, but it was a time when you could, relatively speaking, well, speak your mind. But yeah, I don't. I just find that the, the, the generational gaps as well, and just how quickly things have shifted, is just so rapid. Uh, do you remember a time, by the way? I mean, no, you're younger, but
mhm.
without the internet at all?
Oh, yeah, yeah, I remember the 90s. Yeah, the 90s were. It's hard to not be nostalgic about the 90s, I'll say that. I don't really have any memories of the 80s. I was technically alive in the 80s, but,
Mm.
I don't really have any strong memories from them at all. Say from very vague childhood ones, but the 90s were just the time I remember very vividly as being a much more innocent time and a time that held much more promise too. There was this
Oh yeah,
understanding that
yeah.
maybe American normalcy would resume, and it turned out that the corruption was just baked too far down into our society, and that there was no kind of turning the ship around. I guess I think turning the ship around is always possible. It just relies on certain elite voices to kind of get on board with this understanding of change, and that really hasn't occurred yet. You see some signs,
Well,
I think, here and there, but who knows, right?
in the 90s, if I recall, having lived through it as a both a basically as a young adult, there was a kind of unbounded optimism. It seemed as if a lot of people are looking forward, especially these days. I meet a lot of very young people, people that didn't even know the 20th century,
Mm,
and I think it's hard for them to grasp the kind of um, enthusiasm people were bringing to the table when they were looking forward to, basically the great turn of the century. And the 90s, yeah, just seemed to me a time where a lot of people were just thinking of things were going to get quote unquote really good.
yeah,
Uh, when, well, it's turned out not to be that way for the most part. But that's kind of how I remember the 90s. The 90s were just this time where there's a lot of optimism. There was this new technology, but it hadn't reached the point where it had driven us insane like the current technology. So without the internet, right? I mean, for most of the 90s didn't really have a large internet presence. Um,
yeah. Well, I mean, it was the internet. It was also just. I mean, this is. I don't know, maybe it differentiates us ideologically, but there's just a bunch of absolute bullshit that we'd essentially convinced ourselves was true, and those ideas came from the 60s more than they did the 90s. But by the
the
90s, they'd
triumph of
kind of
democracy, do you mean, for
the
example?
triumph of democracy over totalitarianism, the idea of the autonomous self, that
Yeah.
the self that choices exist in some kind of autonomous vacuum such that they can be self-justifying, which is kind of ridiculous, or that they occur in some kind of platonic isolation chamber, separated from input. um, Also, just our I mean, you talk about this all the time, but also our understanding of the sexual revolution.
Mm.
In there was, obviously the sexual revolution happened in the late 60s, early 70s, but it was kind of rolled back a little bit. And there was this understanding that, okay, well, maybe the new American norm is going to be this sort of hybrid system. But as people learned, as soon as the millennials hit that, basically the controls went right out the door, and the sort of superstructure the boomers relied on to fall back and ground themselves in their 30s just wasn't there for the millennials.
Yeah, you're speaking of generations. I feel as a Generation Xer that we're kind of in the future we might be dubbed the forgotten generation. I don't really,
Mm,
no one really hurls the same aspersions typically at us that they do the boomers, but we didn't really do anything. We were sort of, I feel as if we were on the cusp in a lot of ways. I think a lot of the systems that had ceased to work, we could bear witness to
yeah.
as well. I remember. being exhorted by my parents and basically everyone, go to university because it's just good to go to university rather than for some practical reason. Be an educated person. Having an education is important. Jobs, yada yada yada. But already then, I had seen that there were sort of fissures emerging, and this was in the mid '90s. Um, yeah, so I feel like Generation X is this weird, or we are weird, this weird entity that nobody really talks about because we're just pretty unremarkable. We didn't, I mean, the boomers kind of set things up in a certain way, but we didn't really do much. And the millennials seem to be the first generation to catch wind of some of the more profound changes that took place. And I think, well, you're a millennial.
Yeah, I'm an older millennial. I mean,
Which,
obviously the boomers, sorry, the Generation X and their parents, the silent generation, they're kind of the off generation because they're definitionally smaller than populations wax and wane, and the boomers were the boom, and then the millennials were their sub boom, right? So
yeah,
the off generations in that cycle are going to be a little bit smaller and have less impact, but it does. I think this. The Franklin says this too, or I think he's a mutual friend of ours,
hmm
also known. Well, I won't dead name him, or dead YouTube name him, but I think he's a mutual friend of ours, and
hmm
he says that the Generation X is sort of the ideal vantage point from which to view the passing of the old world and the incarnation of the new one, and I think that's true. I think as sort of a millennial who's particularly aware, sort of a precocious millennial, I think I can sort of see it as well. People who, I mean, there are sort of all these sort of little promises that you can see as kids, like just thinking about something like one of my friends, also academic agent, associates this feeling with a show like Fresh Prince of Bel Air. It presents this view of racial politics that is, it's sincere and it's just totally not what we believe these days or anything approaching to what we thought was going on in the 90s now looking back. And
yeah, I think that's right. I think Generation X does have a connection to the past, and of course we also are bore witness to these changes, and we're still a lot of us are still around, so we've seen the transformation and the sheer horror of it. To be honest, it really was a more innocent time in the '80s and certainly in the early '90s, and it was a time, I guess you could say, where the world still made sense, well, sort of.
mm,
And you fast forward to now, and there are a lot of things I don't even try to understand anymore, particularly as it pertains to sort of progressive politics.
so I believe it does
Um,
make sense. I just think that the progressive, I just think that like, I believe that we were just lied to. I mean, once you discard the progressive promises as just being pure lies, then you can we can I do complain about the difficulty of the situation we're in, but the logic of why we're in this situation makes a lot of sense. The only thing that
well,
doesn't make sense is why people believed in these lies to begin with, right?
could you elaborate on some of them maybe?
I mean, okay, so like the idea, um, let's. I mean, like we already mentioned democracy, but sort of the idea that we could run the sexual marketplace as sort of a machine where our instincts about pleasure and emotion would lead us to some kind of healthy dynamic that would lead to long-term relationships. You see this in the 90s quite clearly in like romantic comedies like Love Actually
Oh,
or
dude,
whatever.
don't get me. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
actually talked to the Franklin about this both privately and I think publicly. I remember the late '90s in particular, the early 2000s, just being chock-a-block filled with these films. Like Serendipity was one of them with Kate Beckinsale and John Cusack. These sort of where in this case they meet on an I think in a department store, and sort of magic occurs and they meet again. Just
Mm.
filled with these types of films of sort of this the trashiest Hollywood romance you could imagine. And I remember kind of almost vaguely believing in some of it, a little bit. If you've seen enough of it, it's brainwashing, obviously. But yeah, things
Well,
like that. Yeah.
sort of like the one people mention is Love Actually from 2000, I
Oh,
think.
oh gosh,
But
yeah,
but
yeah,
but
yeah,
more than
yeah.
that, like the one that I think was actually sort of set the tone for this more was the purportedly quote unquote realist, but actually chock full of lies, When Harry Met Sally, which
Mm.
displays sort of a couple that's on the back end of it's like a boomer late in life love story, and this is sort of they're on the back end of a post-sexual revolution set of unsuccessful relations, and then they just kind of fall into this deeply personally fulfilling like true love. And of course, it's got Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal, and takes place in New York. And this is sort of the dangerous product of the '90s. In Harry Met Sally, you kind of see what the really toxic mixture of lies and truth. And it's true that a lot of baby boomers were able to sort of pull this move off, where they were able to land a post-sexual revolution life in stable relationships. But this is not really it's not workable at a large scale, and it relied on a number of fixtures to be in place, particularly the expectation that marriage was a good thing, in order for people to even ante up and try this operation. And so what you have, you have people using these sort of extraordinary circumstances as sort of a model going forward, and the millennials kind of believe that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that also if you look back at the 60s and the 70s, well, 70s and 80s are where American divorce peaks, incidentally. But on top of that, there were, as you I think correctly pointed out just now, these fixtures that were still in place. I guess you could say, relics of a bygone age, maybe. And that added a little bit of support to the notion that maybe, say, marriage is a good institution and maybe it's something that's functional. I think another big thing that really held everything in check was just lack of technology, frankly speaking. Uh, Probably in more recent years than in older years, but I've spent a lot of time on my channel talking about the effects of technology on intersexual relations,
Mm-hmm.
and it has absolutely and utterly transformed the landscape to a degree that it's in some ways unrecognizable and particularly hopeless for a lot of individuals.
Social
But
media definitely hurt, but
yeah,
in my mind, it just accelerated a force we could already see. Like, social
yeah,
media
yeah, yeah.
wasn't well integrated in 2009, and by 2009, I could already see, like, very precipitously the decline from the innocence of the '90s.
Yeah, I
So
agree. It was building up. Yeah.
yeah, it was building up, and I definitely think the social media accelerated it. I think the Twitter and especially high speed dating apps that were, let's not mince words, imported from similar apps developed for the gay community under different circumstances. There just been a pox on modern development of the human race in any capacity. And it's really hard to see how we're going to overcome this. But we'll have.
Well, we'll get to talking. I don't think we
Yeah.
will, but yeah, it definitely was building up, and the groundwork certainly been laid in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, obviously birth control. I mean, it's impossible to ignore. But at least in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was still a semblance of it's something I spent a lot of time on, of an accessible dating market, right?
Mm.
Uh, a lot of, I mean, with the Zoomers in particular, um, a lot of them are incredulous at the idea that people, normal guys, in fact, in the late 90s and early 2000s, could even have dates, that this was a thing that took place, and
Mm.
uh, because it's such an alien concept to a lot of them, and so inaccessible. So even though I think it was, as you pointed out, I think I agree, the groundwork had been laid and it was building up. Um, the social media and the internet really was the nail that was nailed the coffin shut. I think there there's just I don't see any. I mean, I always say this quite bluntly. People want to go back to some time when it wasn't quite as bad. Well, you're going to have to destroy the internet infrastructure and all these technologies to do so, and maybe that'll happen one day. But as long as we have with the current system, I don't see any return whatsoever, at least for the average person.
Well, you
But
have you have to
I mean,
restructure them. I mean, the fiber optics cables themselves aren't the issue. The issue is how they're being used and how we're encouraged to use them, and the incentives of the companies that are designing software for us to use them. You know,
Well, how would you restructure them? I'm curious.
well, I mean, first of all, we need to sort of get rid of this concept of these large social media companies that basically make money off of holding our attention. We need to massively. I mean, if I were in charge, I would basically highly regulate online dating and probably legalize most forms of online pornography, especially OnlyFans, under basically for mass digital prostitution, which is essentially what they're doing with more steps involved. And they're absolutely capsizing the human mating market in order to make money off of it. And I see no reason to facilitate in them. I don't see why they should make money off this. I don't see what value they provide the body politic, and the only thing they're doing is absolutely degrading the human animal and preventing the reproduction of the very human animal that they make money off of by selling them these apps. And it's these things aren't like loose. It's not like we have a bunch of in the 90s. It was just thousands of websites that that had this stuff, and you couldn't possibly get rid of it all. The problem isn't the 1,000 websites that are like little GeoCities accounts. I'm going speaking of the late 90s. The problem are big mainframe social media hubs that are routed through highly restricted devices like your iPhone. These areas of addiction are don't come from a lot of different places. They come from like 10 different sources, and they go through a few conduits. You shut down the conduits, and they'll die if you have the political
Yeah,
will to do so.
if you have the political will and power to do so. I mean,
Mm.
I don't disagree that those could be measures that might be effective. It's just at least from my vantage point, I don't see how one would have a snowball's chance of even affecting any of that change. I mean, it just, I mean, I don't mean to be insulting. It
Mm.
seems like pie in the sky, to be honest.
Well, who knows? I mean, obviously, I don't think change is coming. Like I said, we don't have the elites on our side. So,
No.
this change will not come until the elites understand that this problem directly impacts their quality of life, and they need to confront it. In which case, I think the only option will be to you know restructure our government. The problem is that a lot of these things, a lot of these decisions we've made, they're baked into the business model, not only of the new corporations that sprung up in the internet age, but also institutions like the mainstream, what the mainstream media has become, and modern university systems, and the horde of unelected bureaucrats that essentially rule the government. And I don't see how we get around restructuring all of those things. But again, the problem is not that people are doing these things. That's not the most immediate problem. The most immediate problem is that the people who should care about this don't care about this, and they don't see the consequences of not caring about this. So nothing is going to get done until that class is on board. And
Sure.
I think that I think what we're seeing right now is this. I imagine that the Biden administration is going to be the slow beginning of disillusionment from that class. But I could be wrong. Maybe it will be 100 years before people, confront this.
You're speaking of the managerial class. Yeah, I believe. Well, I mean, I've talked about this as well. I had a recent video I put up just literally yesterday about a related topic. I mean, I think that to a large degree, increasingly, we're all in, this has always been the case to some degree, is just human nature, inhabiting different epistemic realities. But as far as the managerial class is concerned, sometimes they're called the coastal elite, whatever.
Mm.
They really do live in a different reality bubble. I mean, they're effectively a different cultural species from many of us. I mean,
Mm. They're a
uh,
different cast.
yeah, they're a different caste, but one thing I've talked about on my channel as well, if you go back many centuries, you have this. Yes, you have different castes, you have different social class, but there was still a connection just by dint of the relative primitiveness of the environment. And there was this concept of, noblesse oblige and the obligations of the elite
Mm.
to the lesser elite. Uh, that just has ceased to exist for quite some time. And this has fueled the alienation, the separation that people. I mean, Charles Murray talks about it in his books, and actually in his hometown of Newton, Iowa, as he always likes to reference, how the
Mm-hmm.
CEO used to live, somewhere down the block, and you could see him all the time. Uh, I think in part there's been this cultural speciation, and that has led in largest measure to this uncaring attitude that you're describing of the
Mm-hmm.
managerial classes towards everybody else. And if you view everyone else as a different species, then what's happening on the ground isn't going to matter to you much, since you're at least nominally not affected by it.
Yeah, I don't. That's absolutely the reason why they're not waking up to this. There's. I mean, again, I have no idea how this is going to play out. One option is that the PMC sees their own fail sons and fail daughters dive off the deep end in their mid 30s, and more of them start coming around to how they need future generations to not be like this. That might be a little bit of an outside chance. The other possibility is that just the endemic decline of things like inflation and crime just get worse and worse and worse until they come around. And the third option is just our society starts crumbling, and then a new society that can actually tackle this problem just pushes its corpse out of the way and rules North America in a much more effective way. And I guess the fourth one being that some AI god comes into existence. That's obviously a possibility too. I tend to
I
think
mean,
that one's less likely, but I'm not ruling it out certainly.
I would probably bet on the decline one, but I think a lot of people forget that decline can take a long
Oh
time. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
people talk about the decline of Rome, but it certainly didn't happen in a day or even a few years. And absolutely, one thing that's been incensed to me quite a bit. I mean, I'm originally from New York City, and it's turning, and I'm concerned because my parents are still alive, and they're there.
Hmm.
Shortly after the lockdowns, my father was assaulted and nearly lost his life.
Oh
First
no,
time and since he was there, in his 80s,
that's
by a bunch of
terrible.
hooligans. Absolutely, and these hooligans had been doing it to various people, taking advantage of the lockdown circumstances, of course. And so they were known as basically perpetrators, but because they were slightly below 18, nothing happened to them.
Hmm.
And I've just been reading about just the crime skyrocketing nonstop, especially since the latest mayor's taken off, Adams. People being pushed onto subway tracks. It's insane, and it's I just don't see this getting better. I mean, I'm particularly worried about New York City just because I have elderly parents there, but
Hmm.
it's I I the thing that really gets me, and this is why I made a video a while back, how I sort of declared myself as officially being on the right, because
Hmm.
in some other dimension I would be some milquetoast centrist. I've never felt particularly pulled to the left or the right, but because of things like this and what's been happening, and in light of what happened to Mr. Floyd, and I don't really want to go there, but
Hmm.
essentially, you know, despite the acute need for more police presence, more effective policing, they're basically recalling stuff like that in places like in New York City and larger cities, and it's so I see the decline just happening now, and it's going to go on probably for decades. I think
I'd
potentially,
imagine. And people
yeah,
are optimistic because they remember this happening in the 70s, and then getting slowly pulled back across the 80s,
yes,
and really in the 90s. That's when the effective measures really came in. And but the problem is, I think that in many ways, as modern progressives are wont to do, this time when they made the reform, they sort of tore the brakes out of the system. They saw the mechanisms by which the system corrected itself from the 70s radical moves, and they've kind of taken steps to make sure that that doesn't occur again. Now, once more, this is all about political power, and I could be easily proven wrong. There could easily be sort of a Thermidorian reaction coming from elements within the Biden administration where they kick out all of the they kick out all of the BLM people, and they kick out all the radical anarchists, and they just decide crime policy is going to be this way. But I don't see that this is going to turn around because in the previous generations, the consciousness of the country was quite different than it is right now. Right
Yeah.
now, the left is in the middle of a religious fervor, which frequently happens with belief systems, and nothing's really going to stop the process that has occurred.
Yeah, I have a very, very dismal view of what's happening in the United States. I think the country is just doomed, frankly.
Mm,
I mean, there are pockets where people can escape to, I imagine, but uh, I have friends there still, and it honestly, when I hear some of the stories and I listen to what's happening on the ground, it's really heartbreaking. I mean, I have a friend from Kansas City, and the things he tells me, it's not just the crime, it's just the level of despair and hopelessness, and you can see it in people's eyes.
mm,
And I mean, we want to talk about the black pill. Well, it's hard, given the direction things are going, not to have that sense of the black pill, which is one of these terms which, depending on who you ask, means different things.
mm,
But it's utterly depressing, and all you need to do is open the news. And I just read a couple of days ago, two police officers in their 20s were slain in New York
yeah,
City.
they got ambushed.
They
That's
got ambushed by a repeated felon that should have still been behind bars,
yeah,
mind you, but it's par for the course, right?
yeah. This
And
is
by the way, it's
mm,
what, the DA of New York City, I mentioned this in the previous video, and he wants to basically um, not fully prosecute certain types of crimes up to armed robbery, by the
yeah.
way. I was just thinking, this is what I mean when I say I don't really understand the world anymore. Maybe I'm just because I'm old and old-fashioned, but
uh,
it just doesn't really make sense to me, especially when crime has been up, say, in New York City over the last 2 years, 35%. It's astonishing.
well, I mean, it's a religious fervor. I mean, this is the promise of sort of the civil rights revolution. What happened is we promised people a number of things in the civil rights era of the 1960s, and those promises were kind of bullshit. To be quite honest, we couldn't deliver on the promises of the civil rights era, and the boomers decided that they would just kind of be hypocrites, say one thing and do another. But their children, the millennials and the Xers, they were raised with this vision of egalitarianism as an actual religion, and now what you see is it's manifesting in true belief. The people who are in charge right now believe in egalitarianism and equality. They actually
I
believe it, and so if there are inequalities, then that must come from oppression, and
it
that sort of lands us in the place we are right now.
do you I mean, I certainly that's true of the younger, the young millennials, the Zoomers, almost certainly. But I think of a guy like Mayor Adams, a guy who was elected to office,
Mm.
who, in addition to the most recent deaths, he attended the funeral of some little baby who got a gun blast to the face. I mean, I don't think he's a true believer. I think he's just a politician taking advantage of just riding the wave of religious fervor coming from other people. I mean, maybe he is, but I think he's 60, so it seems unlikely that he would fall into that category. But
So
I,
I
I
don't know
guess,
New York politics that well, despite living very near to New York. But I'll
mhm,
just bring another politician up that I know better, Jenny Durkham from Seattle. I mean,
mhm.
she's a younger woman, not young for a politician, but well, young for a politician, not young for as we'd ordinarily conceptualize it. But I don't think she believes a single thing, has believed a single thing in her entire life. But the reason why she does all this insane stuff with regards to the crime policy, or did, is that there are 1,000 screaming activists underneath her, like Squama Shawant, who just have they're absolute Puritans, and they're ready to make her life and political career absolute hell unless she defers to them on a choice set of issues, and she always does. Because when the crime goes up, she can blame that on people who aren't directly exerting political force on her, on her, I don't want to say regime, on basically on her candidacy. I'll say that. And crime doesn't do that, right? There's no constituency that's going to blame her for that. She'll just say, oh well, this is the COVID epidemic, blah 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 blah, and this is how things are these days. This is the new normal.
Well, in the case of NYCM, I try to keep a little bit abreast. It's been
Mm.
years since I've been there. Adams, who was competing against Yang at the time, he won. He won for a variety of reasons. He's a former police officer, but his platform was basically, this was after what happened to Mr. Floyd, of course, was he wanted to reduce police brutality and abuse and change the approach when it comes to policing. And that, I think, there was one of the there were some other reasons that he was elected. And I think, yeah, almost certainly he might believe in that a bit as a former police officer, but uh, he's doing this sort of cater to the activists who would have his political head if he did otherwise. Because none of this stuff makes sense when you have, I mean, particularly this way, right? A lot of countries locked down due to the pestilence. That's how I refer to it.
Mm.
So I don't have problems with YouTube. The pestilence, and in most countries, say in Europe, where I live, crime actually went down significantly, right? But in the United States, it actually went up. Um,
Mm.
go figure. And it seems to me that they must really feel beholden to these zealots, I guess, who are holding their feet to the fire on this, because otherwise, why would you have such asinine, idiotic policing and law enforcement policies when in probably every major city in the United States, crime is going up right now? It boggles the mind. They must really, really be afraid of these sort of progressive zealots, I guess, in order to do that to the point where they're putting people's lives in danger and don't really care very much about that.
Well, I
I
mean,
can't really think of any other explanation.
well, they're afraid. I mean, they are also. I mean, you never really understand. It's always hard to parse this out, but they also sort of believe in this bullshit a little bit themselves. This is the ideology of the colleges. This is the ideology of basically all of America. This is this it's the civil rights ideal, right? And if George Floyd is the new civil rights battle, then you know what is better than civil rights? What shouldn't be sacrificed for equality between the races, between racial harmony? And the answer is we never told anyone any higher good than that. So this is their belief system now. People, this is the thing with democracy. People don't really, there isn't really such thing as a democracy. It's a series of interest groups and a series of sort of religious concepts that politicians appeal to. And once shared religion or shared ancient religion goes out the window, you start developing necessarily these politicized religions like wokeness, which is essentially just it's just the continuation of the progressive worldview, and now in a more puritanical fundamentalist form. But this is
Well,
how democracies ordinarily work, and everyone who was undertaking this experiment at the time of the founding fathers understood that if you don't have a grounding in a value set that's bigger than the political system you're engaged in democratically, then the political system democratically is going to go absolutely nuts, and it's going to get immediately captured by puritanical religious lunatics. I mean, I use religion broadly to mean just any ideology, which I think is kind of a more effective, a more useful way of looking at how these things work generally.
yeah, yeah. And I always say that the thing about progressivism, that's sort of baked into the nature of progressivism. It always has to progress somewhere. It never, there's never enough, right?
Mm.
You get to B, and then you got to go to C and D and E and F, and you just got to go through the whole alphabet eventually. Which is why you know, I, I've always been reluctant to describe myself as right wing, but I guess that's just what I am by dint of my opposition to so much of what's going on right now. I mean, I know people on the left would label me that way anyway, but it just feels odd to me. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to accept it now. But I mean, we're kind of talking about these grim events, and I think a lot of it is sort of related to the black pill.
Mm-hmm.
But since the black pill was the topic that you wanted to discuss with me, I mean, it seems like a good opening to
Yeah.
since the United States is burning both literally and figuratively, so why not, right?
Well, I guess so. Here's sort of my reaction and kind of why I was so eager to have a conversation. I generally really like your channel, and I noticed I was listening to a bunch of your videos, and I found myself disagreeing with you in ways that I'm usually not want to disagree, like agreeing with sort of internet hucksters and chat advice columnists over more thoughtful people, and also thinking, and this is sort of very uncharacteristic of me, that the problem is actually really really simple. When other people say it's very very complicated, I think the black pill videos had sort of one central question that kept on coming up was is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak. The thing is I believe very strongly that once we define our terms and just speak in plain language about what it is we're actually talking about and the probabilities involved, then I'm not going to say that there's an easy answer, but it's very stark and very simple what choice we have to make. And that's sort of where I'm coming from is I think that I think it's really simple, and we have a really simple choice ahead of us, and we're going to have to make it one way or the other. But that's just how it is, and uh, we can discuss which side's better, but and I think I probably will come down to disagreement about values. I anticipate.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, for the record, I don't really talk about it much. I'm certainly not a fedora tipper, but I'm not a religious person. I mean, I don't try to
Mhm.
hide that. I don't really have anything against religious people, but I'm just happen not to be myself. So obviously, when I'm talking about these matters, black pill or otherwise, I'm not incorporating any religious view
Mhm.
because I mean, I'm not religious. Um, I understand, of course, coming from a Catholic perspective in particular, that one would have a different view. And indeed, I mean, I should also say for the record that a lot of people, I think, mischaracterize or maybe misunderstand the idea behind my thoughts here. Is that I'm not trying to suck people into the black pill. It's very much for people who are already there, the content, right? I'm not trying to lure people. I don't have a worm in the end of a fishing rod trying to come over here. It's just that for the people who have kind of gone down the rabbit hole, as I might describe it, that's basically what the content or who the content is for.
Mhm.
I think um, I wouldn't want ideally people to go down that rabbit hole because I do think it's ultimately, if not outright destructive, potentially very destructive. And one thing I've noticed, I have some online acquaintances at least, or Catholic nominally or otherwise, that there is a potential for community within a religious community, at least in a religious sense. But I'm just not sure how accessible that is to a lot of people because a lot of people just A, aren't religious,
Mhm.
and B, aren't Catholic. Um, I imagine that even given the exigencies of our time, if you have that type of community, you can still, I mean, you can really still get a lot done and still have a high degree of functionality.
Mhm.
But not many people have those. But then I'm not. But then again, I was going to ask you to sort of
Mhm.
maybe a little clarify a little bit. You meant there's a choice. There's it's sort of a binary, a choice, one choice or the other. And certainly we probably would have different values. Obviously, since I'm not a religious person, so I'd be curious just if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Sure. So, the question is the juice worth the squeeze? So
Hmm.
the vagary, and this is not. I know that this is poetic language. Obviously, I'm not accusing you of anything, but the sort of implicit vagueness of the statement that I kind of get caught on is what's the juice. So, if the most obvious answer is the juice is pleasure. If the juice is pleasure, then the answer is obvious. The juice is not worth the squeeze. There's no way you're going to juice more out of difficult things like dating in terms of pure dopamine than you will out of pornography. And I'm sure that Mark Zuckerberg is cooking up all sorts of virtual reality simulated stimulation experiences that will be 1,000 times better than the pornography we have right now. As they say in Train Spotting, the reason why you do heroin's for the pleasure, right? They're not stupid, right? This is the deal. This stuff is more pleasurable than the alternative of living a life. And so the answer to the question, is the pleasure worth the squeeze for the sake of pleasure, is obviously no. And if you're an optimizer of pleasure, then there is no point in playing this game or doing anything except for waiting for the metaverse to absorb you in it and become Mark Zuckerberg's toy. Um, there is a choice on whether we are living our lives for pleasure or for some broader purpose. I guess there's potentially a middle ground in the concept of happiness, but that can be a little bit more difficult to define. And I still think that technically, a case can be made for that we're not doing very much for our own happiness by doing this, by sort of giving in to modern temptations. But it gets more complicated there. But I think it's more stark when you just, on a personal level, you have to at some point decide whether you're living your life for pleasure or for purpose. We're either people who are living our lives for a purpose, who are temporarily tempted and sometimes give in to the temptations of pleasure, or we're people who are living our lives for pleasure, who are haunted temporarily by an absence of purpose. Uh, Depending on how you answer this fundamental question, that's what's going to constitute how you react to the modern world. Again, I said there's a middle ground of like trying to shift from pleasure to happiness. I think you get somewhat similar results, but we could explore that too. But I think that is the question, right? And you're either on one side of it or not, right? It's very binary in my
Well,
worldview.
sure, but you might, in my opinion, you might be missing some steps there.
Mm.
So I think you end up in the pleasure matrix, as it were, because the purpose has been stripped from you, right? It's sort of a
Yes.
default, right? When you don't have some sort of telos in front of you, you just default to your instincts, which is going to be the gratuitous pleasure that a lot of people chase. I think in a lot of cases, especially for young men, the black pill mentality emerges precisely because ideally they would like to chase some purpose, but the world appears to them, at least, to be utterly barren of it, and therefore, what's left? There's sort of these nominal pleasures, but even then, it becomes difficult. So all they're left with are sort of the cyber versions of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, I think this is where maybe there's a sort of not even a conflict of values, but maybe a conflict of visions. I can fully imagine were I a religious person, a sincere religious
Mm-hmm.
believer, that very little of that would be an issue because the telos, the purpose, would be clear to me. But lacking that, and I think a lot of these young guys in particular are lacking that as well. Never mind young women,
Mm-hmm.
separate topic, I guess. Finding a purpose is extremely difficult. And I think it was to some degree possible in a bygone age, even without necessarily religious belief, although I'm sure one could contest that. But in the current meta, as I sometimes, to use gaming talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just I don't know how that's possible. So yes, people are, you're very much right. They're left in just sort of this pleasure matrix of just chasing one hedonic high after the other. And even you mentioned OnlyFans. I mean, OnlyFans, I think, isn't just serving the pleasure matrix. It's serving the other aspect of sort of romance, that desire for intimacy and attachment and closeness. It's a very poor simulation of it,
Yeah,
but
that's only a
it kind
lie,
of,
right? I mean,
yeah,
it can't be divorced from that, right? That it's
yeah, it's trying to simulate it, at least, and they're guys who are chasing after that. But I think it's not really. Again, if I were a religious person, or most people were, or
mm,
most people were Catholic, I think it would be very easy to just say, well, yeah, there are these issues, but there's still this purpose. But without some kind of, for lack of a better phrase, divine incentive, I think a lot of people are going to find it nigh impossible to find a purpose in the morass that we currently find ourselves in, because everywhere they turn, it's just very confusing. A lot of people, for example, who are, well aware that progressive politics are, toxic and corrosive, what's the alternative? The alternative is something that, well, if you oppose it, you're going to be put down anyway. So it's just sort of,
Well, this is it's funny you mentioned this, right? Because like there are a lot of people in the right wing community that aren't properly religious, like Catholic. They're sort of like vague deists, or
mhm.
maybe they're like Einsteinian atheists, or atheists nominally but believe in some higher kind of stoical purpose, something more like Buddhism or Stoicism, or like these sort of non-theistic religions, but are still kind of classical religions and every other thing than that. So this is something I'm kind of noticing as an emergent theme. And it's kind of good that we mentioned the 90s and the before times because, I mean, so, I used to be an atheist. And, like back in the day when I was an atheist, I kind of got out of atheism just as like everyone else in my generation was getting into it. So it was a very weird experience doing this. But I do remember back in the day talking to Christians, and this problem, the meaning crisis, came up. And I know for a fact my answer for this, and I'm pretty sure it would have been the answer for a similar person to me in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or the 50s. And that is we would bust out our Sartre and our Camus and we'd give an existentialist answer. And the existentialist answer for the meaning crisis is that in the absence of meaning, man himself is called to be the heroic creator of meaning himself. And this was the atheist answer of my youth, and maybe people have just given up on this project. It sounds like
I can
this
tell you
telling you.
why. Because I'm not an existentialist myself per se, but I've studied it. I think
Mm,
existentialism arose precisely people like South Camus. You look at particularly essays like The Myth of Sisyphus. It arose at a very particular time, um, during and really against the backdrop just after World War II,
mm.
which was a time, arguably, of some kind of heroicism, right? There was a purpose to be found in opposing, say, the evil of the NS or whatever. Um, I think the problem with sort of that sort of existentialist view in the current climate and meta is that there isn't any grand evil or evil narrative that you can oppose in that sense.
Yeah,
And
that
so,
that contradicts the thesis of existentialism. The thesis of existentialism isn't God is dead, but oh, good thing we have like Hitler as the grand evil to rage against to give us meaning. The point of the existentialist was even in a completely meaningless universe, humans could choose to manufacture meaning just by pure choice.
that's what they thought, but Sartre
Yeah.
was a resistance fighter. I mean, he was deceiving, in my opinion, he was deceiving himself when he wrote and said these things because the reason why he came to these conclusions was because he felt emboldened by a purpose during his time as a
Hmm.
resistance fighter in the French resistance. It wasn't just, I don't think it happened in a vacuum. I agree with you in theory, that's the way it should be, but I think it would have been impossible without the backdrop of World War II and that feeling of empowerment and heroism that these guys and Camus to a lesser degree uh, felt.
No,
You have the
I
idea,
agree, but I
yeah,
mean, like,
yeah.
if that explanation, like, if we admit that this existentialist understanding of meaning and purpose and morality goes out the window, then like a major part of the progressive vision has just been declared to be fraudulent. I mean,
Well,
and because now the questions of the anti-enlightenment just come back with a vengeance, and there's just no answer for them. Like
well,
now we just say that like progressivism is pure poison for society.
I'm not a. You're
Yeah.
kind of
Okay.
talking to the. I'm
Oh,
not a
sorry. Maybe I'm
progressive,
preaching to the
obviously.
choir, but like, I don't know. Like, that's like, well, I mean, I guess this is just where we are right now. Like that's, but then we're saying that like there needs to be an external force of meaning, which means there needs to be a religion, right?
Well, I mean, it right, and I think this is kind of where it becomes tricky because especially given the current climate. I mean, it's not a religious climate. I'd
I
imagine.
disagree.
Well, yes, it is. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are people who are wedded to a different set of religious beliefs than conventional ones. I mean, progressivism very much seems almost axiomatically religious in certain regards. But um, I mean, take myself for example. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. I've never been a kind again a fedora to. I just, I just say I don't have a religious bone in my body. It's never. I've not like I haven't looked into stuff. I have quite
Mm-hmm.
extensively at times. And they're gonna be so. And there are other people out there like that too. Again, I think if a person can find a religious community or even some kind of meta-religious narrative, then that's good, and I would encourage that individual to follow it. But I think a lot of the guys out there are just at least unreachable in that regard. Some of them might be, but so the question is, what do you do with that? I mean, if some not so insignificant portion of the population, I, I mean, ideally, I guess in your vision, everyone would become Catholic, I'd imagine. But that doesn't seem likely to happen. I'm not even arguing whether it's good or bad, but that just doesn't seem likely to happen.
I mean,
Uh,
I'm actually don't think that's going to happen. I think that what's going to happen
yeah.
is, I think what's going to happen is what happened at the end of the fall of the Roman Empire. What's going to happen is a series of strong men are going to come. They're going to crush the life out of the old order, and in the wake of that uh, destruction, a lot of different traditionalist religions, Catholicism being one of them, will take root again and begin thriving. And just as in the original fall of the Roman Empire, it will be a time of much religious uncertainty. Not so much in the sense that we have uncertainty now, but in a lot of different religions contesting for space and either merging together or triumphing over the other one
Well, I think
politically.
it's already happening if right. I mean, if progressivism is a religion, then it certainly has its adherents, and there are other people who believe other things. I mean, people are certainly looking for some kind of overarching belief that can inform their lives, without question. So maybe we're already in that,
But I
but
think progressivism is dying because it's unstable. I
uh,
think that it's. I think that. I mean, when I say dying, I mean I don't think it can last for 100 or 200 more years. I think that it's.
well,
It could
maybe
last for
not.
100 maybe. But like it's
Well,
too. It's biologically it has an insane disadvantage replacing itself, and
I
it's
agree.
capsizing the
Yeah.
institutions that it's in charge of, right? So it's institutionally, it seems like it can't last there either.
Sure, and I wouldn't disagree. Maybe it only lasts another 50, 60, 70 years, but I think we could agree that it gets to do a hell of a lot of damage in that time, and really maybe so much damage that the changes and damage that have been wrought become irreversible. I don't know.
Hmm.
It, it seemed. I mean, I guess. I'm very much sort of concerned with the present and the immediate future. I'm to some degree. I worry about the distant future, but if in fact it's quote unquote only around for 50 or 60 more years. I mean, they've already caused so much damage. What will be the consequence of another 50 years of progressive rule? Yeah, I agree. It's not self-sustaining, and it seems to be self-destructive in certain key ways. But I I don't. I don't know for the time being. Now, for example, if you were a young Zoomer,
Hmm.
and I think this is something to point out too. I mean, you have a PhD in engineering, don't you? Something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So you're a really smart guy by
I
definition. I don't
wouldn't
know
know.
if
I
you're you.
wouldn't go that far, but
Well, I mean, come
okay,
on,
I'm
Dave.
not. I'm
You have
not
a
stupid,
PhD in
right?
engineering,
Okay,
right? But
okay, like
people who have PhDs in engineering aren't stupid. There you go.
yeah, I'm
But
reasonably able to understand sort of quantitative arguments. Yeah.
well, humility suits you, and I think it is a virtue, and I try to pursue it too. But in any event, I mean, if you were an average guy, really, like I encounter some of these guys frequently with, you know, a simple guy,
Hmm.
maybe not as bright as you are, in, I don't know, living in the heartland of the U.S. and not many options. I just don't. I wish I had good answers, but I don't know if I do to a guy like that because
Hmm.
I think part of the ability to escape from this. I think does come down to sort of just ability, cognitive ability, intellect. I mean, uh, simply because part of the solution, unfortunately, is a monetary solution. I'm not an economist, but there are a lot of economic problems. The ability to earn a decent wage, a decent living, to have prospects, will allow somebody to potentially move to some other place, whether that's in terms of, a different country or a different space, or even just in terms of moving up the ladder of life.
Hmm.
I think one concern I have in general is for the wheel of the average man, and that's just kind of, I don't know what the average man is supposed to do anymore. And because not every guy can be a PhD in engineering
Hmm.
or a lawyer or a code. Learn to code meme, right? What a Yeah. And so honestly, it sounds like a strange thing, but I wouldn't mind if more and more people became sincerely religious, maybe Catholic, because I think it might actually help them, even if I don't believe myself. Um, but I don't know how you would affect a change like that.
Yeah, again, I don't think that I hate to say that I don't think the solution is people becoming Catholic, because part of my belief is that it's true, and that
Mm.
it helps people, although that's not a reason to believe in it, right? You shouldn't believe in something just because you think it helps people. The atheists are right about that, absolutely. But just I am Catholic, but most of my content is sort of a functionally materialist analysis of politics and history. And the issue we're dealing with right now is that the the what young men want right now is they want people to make promises to them that they have a reasonable expectation of keeping, and young women want this too. And the problem is that the only people who are powerful enough to make promises like this have spent the last 30 years lying to both sexes about this. They've told women that, essentially a professional career would be either a path to total fulfillment as a professional, or to a marriage with, an impossibly more professional man, which is statistically impossible. And they told young men that, well, I mean, they told young men they told young men that these hypergamous realities that women want to date up, that women have certain standards, are a function of the patriarchy or something, and that if they ignored them and pursued their own devices, that there wouldn't be an impact on your life. And these are two lies. The problem is that the religious groups are not in a position to make promises that they can keep. They can't promise young men. I could promise a young man that if he joined a monastery, he has a higher possibility of finding a meaning than a life of mindless consumption. But the unlike the government of the United States, we can't promise power or jobs or anything else like that. And so, this is where the sort of political realism comes into play. Whereas I think if I were an individual man, the first question I would be is, am I going to pursue meaning or pleasure? And once I decide that I'm going to pursue meaning, I would, look at my chances for marriage, and I would look at my chances, and I would look at my other options, and I decide accordingly. I know many men who never get married and have incredibly meaningful and dignified lives that are spiritual. I have a lot of priest friends. Wouldn't say I have a lot of monk friends, because by definition they're cloistered. But you encounter people who never marry or never have families, and yet don't live in sort of a squalid life, and they're happy and spiritually fulfilled. And as a young man, that would be sort of my consideration if I decided against the pursuit of pleasure over meaning. And I guess that would be my logic. What I would like to say to young men is, a healthy political system would try to redesign itself so that we could get to the sexual dynamic that existed before 1968, or 1958 for that matter, where the focus was on marriage, and we could tamp down the asymmetries that led a large number of men and women to be basically less in their 40s or 50s. And, I don't think these reforms are impossible, but I think those reforms are impossible without radically restructuring a lot of the institutions in our society. And until that comes about, the thing I can promise the young men, I'm not really promising, but what I can say is that you can statistically raise your chances. First of all, I think that if you decide meaning externally exists, e.g., you are religious, even if you're just religious in some sort of vague Stoic sense or vague Buddhist sense, you can make a decision to pursue meaning and live your life accordingly. Secondly, if you're trying to get something like a family or some kind of material success, you can do things to raise your chances. And we could talk about the chances involved. I don't think, maybe we disagree on this. I think the average guy, if he plays his cards right and targets the right things, he doesn't have a horrible chance of obtaining a family.
I mean, but that, sure, but I guess there are a couple of points I would disagree on them. The
Mm,
biggest one is that this is largely down to institutions. I think institutions are a huge part of it, but you can't one can't disregard the technology such as birth control. It's not a shock if you just look at, I mean, you look at any chart, any stat to see what happens with divorce and marriage. It all seems to be pinned to the emergence of birth control. So institutions are very important, but in the technologies that exist, arguably to some degree, independent of institutions are fairly important as well. Now, one institutional thing that I think is very important is something like no fault divorce. So I'm not sure if I do agree with you that your average guy these days could just have a pretty good chance of finding a wife. I think it's a lot more difficult than you're maybe considering. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're correct. You still have the enormous hurdle that she has that metaphorical gun that the trigger of which she can squeeze at any time.
but
So
that's an institutional gun, to be clear.
yeah, I agree with you. So
Yeah,
that's one institutional
sure,
thing I think
sure.
that is absolutely relevant. But so I mean, even if a young average guy were to get past these hurdles, maybe find somebody, you have this other hurdle, this they call it about ascension of how are you going to manage your marriage, and on top of that, how are you going to make sure that it doesn't go south? And I think you really have limited control over that, in particular because of the other side of the equation, women, half the population,
Hmm.
and the things they're exposed to and their own whims and wishes. I don't think anything like this can work without some degree of cooperation from women who are running on autopilot on their own instincts. They're highly immersed in social media, and it just seems very unlikely to my mind that that would work out. But I think the prospects are a lot grimmer than that. I think your average guy is really going to struggle to find any relationship of substance. Maybe if he's really lucky, he can get a hookup.
Yeah,
But
well, I mean, I think the whole women thing. I think women, tempting the accusation of misogyny here, but women have not culturally adapted to ever be in a position to ask themselves this kind of question. You're not going to get women in positions of power asking themselves like, how are my decisions affecting men of
no,
lesser quality? That's not that has never, to my knowledge, ever happened historically.
no, you're
It's
right.
it's
You're
not
right.
something that women really do. So the change has got to come from institutions and structures that are above women who are making those decisions.
Yeah,
But I think women in power even are very susceptible to institutional sea changes.
sure,
Like
and
they're very sensitive to that stuff, right? So once the institution shifts from under their feet, you also don't get women standing in the tracks going, no, I'm going to die for a second wave or third wave feminism. Like that doesn't happen. Like let's look at the whole turf thing, right? Look at like all of these third wave feminists just eat their words in 3 days after they decided the trans women were women. Right?
right.
Like that's what
Well,
happens, right?
women are creatures of trends, right? So if you could, in theory, get some cultural trend going, most women all, but most women would end up following that
Mm-hmm.
because women are very much creatures of the herd. I agree with that, but whether it's sad or not, I guess the sad thing is there have been many periods of history and prehistory where a lot of men didn't, because they had bad luck, didn't marry or reproduce.
Hmm.
And it could just be that we're going through one of these population bottlenecks right now. The pain of it is simply because it's just much more perceptible now compared to, I don't know, the agricultural revolution. There was a lot of stuff going on then, or a lot of men didn't reproduce, but we're not witnessing that. We're witnessing it now, and it's much more visible due to the internet. I wish for a lot of these guys that they could find some kind of spiritual purpose or something beyond that. But I'm not going to claim I'm the person to give it to them. I'm not a spiritual person. I'm not a
Hmm.
religious person, and that could very well be. I mean, obviously, in some respect, it is a fault because I can't offer a man a sense, in that sense, any hope. I I'm most interested in what's kind of feasible in the here and now. What are the options to give men some sense of meaning, some sense of purpose? But I have really been scratching my head because I look at the landscape and it's very bleak and it's very barren. And again, sure, if someone can find religious purpose, that's great, but that's easier said than done.
Hmm.
And I I just don't see a lot of options. I mean, you seem to be a lot more optimistic than I am, which makes sense. I mean, you're Catholic.
Mm. Well, I mean, like,
Uh,
well, solutions. I think that we are kind of going through a bottleneck. I don't know how tight that bottleneck is going to get. If this is the tightest the bottleneck is, then it's certainly not a bottleneck as narrow as something like, I don't know. There have been a lot of bottlenecks in humanity's history. Bronze Age
yeah,
collapse, and then there was like some kind of Paleolithic collapse as well, where like a very few number of communities survived, right? So this is as narrow as the bottleneck gets. Then it's a small bottleneck, but we're going through it, right? And we'll merge on the other side,
yeah,
right?
but it's more visible. That was my point.
Oh
It's
yeah,
just
it's
easier to
certainly more
just look
visible.
at
I
it.
guess it causes more anxiety because we can see it from all these different angles.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem. Um, I don't know. I mean, I guess in my mind, solutions exist sort of relative to each other. And maybe this is just sort of me looking at things like, I'm a sort of new father, and the thing is that, um, you know, when you look at sort of your relationship with a child that you're sort of imparting wisdom to, it, not giving an answer isn't really an option. You just have to kind of go with your least bad one because no answer is going to default to what society's answer is going to be. So if you don't know something, you still have to provide what is the best that you know. And because of that, it kind of puts you in this position where you're really unwilling to punt. I think sort of the ethos of the 1960s and 70s was that if you weren't sure about something, you just kind of punt to personal choice, and there'd be some kind of vague appeal to existentialism that we kind of, I think, both discovered as bullshit, right? And and I guess I'm not really, I don't know. I don't think that's what's called. I think in this age, what this age is calling for us to give it is the best answers we have. And I do totally agree to you that it certainly depends on if I'm talking to somebody who's really smart and really intelligent and really personable. I would give him very different advice than someone who's average or someone who has definite limitations to their cognitive ability or genetic looks. And that kind of goes against our egalitarian impulse. But I kind of gave up on egalitarianism a long time ago, I guess.
I'm not an egalitarian myself either. I mean, I no, but
No,
I'm
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 not. I'm not
curious.
accusing you. I'm just wondering
Yeah.
if we haven't smuggled in like an egalitarian mindset, like implicitly, because.
Well, in a sense, I mean, I don't want, I'm going to try to take a footnote on that and just or a bookmark that. I did
Mhm,
want to ask you. I mean, I think you have a son, right?
mhm,
Is that
yeah,
accurate?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I, I wonder, given what we know about peer group influence. I mean, once the child leaves the house to any degree, even really starting school and certainly as a teenager, peer influence just increases enormously,
Yeah.
right? To the point where, I mean, you have teenage rebellion, they call it the teenage rebellion years, whatever. Are you at all worried that your son could get sucked into this vortex of vortex of well, progressivism, or just kind of lose touch with what the values that you want to instill in him?
Oh yeah, of course. We always worry about that. I don't think we. I mean, we can give the child. I guess we can give the child that would be best that we know. And when he asks me what I believe, I'm going to tell him what I believe, and obviously, we're going to raise him with the default beliefs we think are true because you can't do anything else, right? You can't. Parents can't punt, and any punt is just an indication that the outside popular culture is going to fill in the question that you didn't answer. So we're obviously going to raise the child with our values.
Hmm.
But I guess one thing that's going to be very different from how my parents raised me, and I guess I hope this is a digression, but I think it's an important one. I think the baby boomers raised the millennials under the assumption that they would all be just extraordinary prodigies, or they would be in like the top 10% of the population in terms of achievement. When what they really should have done is raise their children assuming that they would be smack dab median of their socio-demographic group. And, I'm going to try to instill in my son values that will help him if he is sort of the average person, like the average person in, in my cultural group, in my Catholic community. Not
Seems unlikely given your own intellect. I mean,
well,
for
more than you
sure.
might think because of regression to the mean, right?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, there's going to be some. Obviously, there's some variation, but it. I mean, yeah,
and
it's a
and the,
separate topic.
and the
Regression to the
variation is
mean,
going to
but yeah,
drag towards the mean, not drag towards the
yeah,
parent.
that's true. That's true.
And so, this is, my father was this brilliant person, and I'm, a little bit above average, but like, there's this regression to the mean that's just natural, and
Yeah,
that's what creates the fail son generation, right? Because the fail son is not untalented, and we should really, I hate the word fail son because there really should be fail son and fail daughter, but fail daughter doesn't, the word fail son.
yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's, it's used more in left wing circles than it is right wing ones. And again, there should really be an equivalent fail daughter. Just doesn't sound as catchy, right? But it's sons of very successful people, or moderately successful people, and they just after they get through college they just tap out hard, because the promised elite status didn't instantly materialize, and they have no tools to understand how to live as a non-elite person.
mm,
And so this creates the phenomenon that right wingers called the midwit, right? The Karen phenomenon, the fedora phenomenon, et cetera, right? Um, and I guess I kind of lost track of my question. I guess, my concern is that, assuming that my son is the average man, to keep him away from the pitfalls that I have seen destroy average men's lives, and the pitfalls that, I mean, I guess, for my own generation, I haven't seen marriage be the primary culprit that destroyed average men's lives. I see drugs, pornography, and video games being a much bigger uh, uh, destructive force in that regard. And I also have noticed certain communities have a much higher success of marriage and making marriage work than others. Having being someone who's gone from a secular community to a religious one, uh, the relative health and stability of the religious marriages is just like orders of magnitude better.
sure. Yeah, no, but again, this is not religious belief is not something you can acquire simply by snapping your fingers, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, it has
I
to be
mean,
taught, right?
I say this freely. I mean, if I could, press a magic button and become a sincere religious Catholic, I would.
Mm.
But again, I don't have a religious bone in my body, so unless some great transformation of my brain takes place, I don't see that happening. I think a lot of people are in that position too. I
Well,
think
yeah,
it is in.
again, and you shouldn't, right? You shouldn't just change your religion because you want a benefit from it, right?
Mhm.
There has to be. I still think there is a space for people who are meaning seekers, but have I'm going to say not yet found a religion, because I think most people who well, maybe this is just my own bias, but I tend to think
I
that
th-
people who are seeking meaning tend to find a home for meaning towards the end of their lives, perhaps. But
I
I do
can
I
only
do
tell
think
you.
there is a place for those people in this vision. I don't think that I'm just preaching to pure Catholics. I,
I think so, yeah. I mean, I can tell you. Look, I mean, as someone without children, who won't have children, who won't get married, who's going to be a genetic dead end and as Sargon likes to say, a immoral parasite, or I already am one. I think what happens with a lot of people, what my default has been for years, is really um, the friendships that I've had over the years, and these are the people I try to, I mean, they're not really, there's a sort of family, right? The sense of community I have with the people I'm close to. I
mm,
try to live for them. I try to be a good person for their sake, to be sincere to them, help them out when I can. Um, but and I'm blessed in some ways to have some of these friendships, for sure, because I think that even this is something I've nobody really talks about in so-called black pill circles, because it's so focused on the mate dynamic. But
mm.
forging good bonds with your fellow males, men, and friendships for that matter, is something that's just not talked about a lot, and it's really fallen by the wayside. And I wonder at times, because it's not so it's talked about so little, if maybe in part a solution that would be attainable is for guys to start looking to reforge some of those bonds that they used to have with their fellow men. I mean,
Yes,
I think
yes.
a lot of the loneliness. I mean, sure, it's not. It's different, obviously, but I think when and I've talked to a lot of these guys, when you're sort of effectively friendless, you feel you don't have men to connect with, and masculine virtues, if you want to call them that, or masculine traits, or eschewed and looked down upon. Your natural default in that situation is just to want to look for some kind of mate partnership, or uh, female attention. But it's something that very few people talk about, and obviously there's huge barriers, as I just said. I mean, male traits are looked down upon, and behavior and interests, and so it's not in the current culture. It's toxic masculinity. They put everyone on Ritalin. It's very, very difficult, especially for the current generation. But I think
And
if
then they
anything would,
actively discourage people from forming these bonds because I personally believe they discourage men from forming these bonds because they're worried about the political ramifications of doing this.
yeah, it's sure, it's certainly possible. I mean, never. I don't want to say never. I'm not a historian. It seems very unlikely to me that there's ever been a period in history when men have been so cowed and browbeaten, and just so it's a bit of a hackney term, emasculated, right? But I don't just mean in the sense of they can't beat their chest, but just they can't be themselves. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're just not allowed to act as they're inclined to, and I mean in the positive sense, not the way people would usually refer to that. And that has the effect that they can't connect with other men, because each man is sort of or each boy in this case, as they grow up, is in his own little prison of being told how he's not allowed to act. And so the ability to forge those bonds has been severed. But I think that is something that might maybe be in the cards. That maybe that would be a possibility of sort of pushing forward, and maybe finding something good in this, yeah, in this morass of black pills. Because it's so weird to me. I never really hear people talk about that anymore. It's all the focus is on, understandably, female attention
Mm-hmm.
and getting a girlfriend, but that aspect of things has been very, very much neglected. And I think that for good reason. Culturally, we just talked about the culturally. It's just there's so many barriers to that. But I think that community, it doesn't even necessarily, in my opinion at least, I mean, obviously if you disagree, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious, but also the way that we live. And I live in a big city, right? And I live in an apartment building, and I can tell you, I don't know a single person, not a one, not a one. And all that leads to this, yeah, this further disconnection from people. Uh, I I think that one thing that's kind of I've thought about on occasion is that one way maybe people could forge ahead is to try to create communities if need. They don't necessarily have to be religious, in my opinion. Find people of like mind. Come up with a plan. I don't know, build a giant house or a bunch of houses around a block. I mean, it's easier said than done. I'm not claiming it's easy to
Yeah,
do,
especially since
but
we've been just nuking all of our social organizations for the last 2 years, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
You
it's. I'm not saying it's easy,
No,
but
you'll notice this. This is an aside, but you'll notice this is that us on the right, we say that the Eye of Sauron, aka the sort of aggressive ire of the mainstream media and the establishment, it focuses us on things quite randomly. But one thing it always gravitates towards are organizations of men. So if for instance, the reason why I'm on my like third Discord account here is because I used Discord for years and years and years as my channel grew, and then when I started an organization, somewhat unsuccessfully, but there were some fruits to it, I immediately got banned. So the second you try to organize and do things in the outside world, they come after you like a ton of brick. They come down on you like a ton of bricks.
yeah, that's yeah, it's horrible. I mean, the one thing that really I find, I mean, in all of this, just astonishing is the it really boggles my mind when I just look at the suffering and despair in people, and I know so many people in that state, how there can be such indifference towards that from I mean, obviously they're religious fanatics, the progressives, many of them. I don't think they've realized how much suffering they've caused, and just in the state of the world right now. I
Mm.
mean, it's I know people in their early 20s that are just empty husks of human beings with nothing to look forward to, and I mean, the only thing they have left is the instinct to cling to life, basically. And
Well,
and a
so
lot,
strange, right? Because I could imagine losing everything I have right now. Like, let's say my family, God forbid, died, and
I
then
hope it doesn't happen.
then I'd lost my profession or something like that, right? I think because of how my life was, I'd be more able to rebuild. But these young men, they seem to have experienced some kind of learned helplessness, and I think that's what people are trying to explain, right?
Yes, but th- I mean, I don't look. I think there's some merit to things like personal responsibility, but I think the forces of the world are very much arrayed and aligned against them. The forces of the world are not making it easy for them on a to find a quest of meaning or
Mm-hmm.
really purpose or forge ahead. And it's there's all this talk, especially in left wing circles, of sort of mental health issues, and I think there are a lot of mental health issues, but not it's baffling to me that they don't observe that how so much of the policies, as we've discussed at length now, have led to some of these issues. I mean, if you're a 19-year-old guy now who there's a good chance, for example, that you were on a steady Ritalin regimen, and you had to be put in your place so you didn't act out in school, and as a consequence, you never were able to really discover what your interests were.
Mm.
I mean, that's another big thing. I mean, so baffling. This is something when I was growing up, I had a ton of interest. In fact, for the longest time, I want to be a zoologist. To this day, I still have kind of an amateur zoologist of sorts. I have an interest in it, but you know, the people just don't really have interest anymore. I talk to the young people, and I mean, I don't consider video games an interest, even though I game less than I used to, but I'm still a gamer.
Mm.
Eh, they just have no. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but they just don't have genuine interest. I mean, things they pursue on the side, like that's a top, and it doesn't have to be. They could be anything. It could be botany. It could be. It doesn't really matter. But this is what I mean by the culture just being arrayed and aligned against them. They're empty husks. They kind of exist. They breathe, but they don't seem driven by anything in particular. And then when I moved from that, I got I developed a lifelong interest in languages, and
Mm.
I don't see anything like that happening. And I'm fully cognizant of the distinct possibility that if I had, I weren't, in my mid to late 40s and I had grown up in this generation, that I could have ended up just like that easily, probably.
Oh yeah, yeah. I have I'm under no illusion that I could have ended up like them as well.
Yeah,
It's
so
it's
I'm
but for the
compassionate
grace of
towards
God,
them.
right?
Yeah, but I don't. I think that's another big sort of glaring gap. The lack of male bonds, friendship, but also a lack of interest outside of very banal. Oh, I'm a gamer. Well, everyone is a gamer, right?
Hmm.
There's just nothing. Or talking about. I don't consider politics an interest, really. Not really. I mean,
Yeah,
it can be,
yeah. You'd have to
but
get
talking
really
about
into it.
politics is something that everybody does these days, right? I mean, everyone thinks he's at least qualified. I don't think I am, but and and when you drill down and say, well, so what do you like? Do you like learning about something? Rarely do I get an answer. I mean, it's very, very disconcerting.
Yeah,
But I think
that's
that's
an
another.
interesting thing,
Yeah.
right? Do you notice this too? How all the media we used to consume now means less than it used to.
Oh
Like
yeah.
like
Yeah.
movies
Absolutely.
used to mean a lot in the 90s, and
Absolutely.
then there was a time when video games used to mean a lot, and then
Yep.
the reason why it's been a long. I mean, I stopped playing video games, AAA video games in 2013, and the I think the last one I played was BioShock Infinite. And I remember that was the last one. I'm like, okay, this one, like, this is there's something edifying in this video game. There's something that I'm learning about the world or myself by playing it. And now, I actually genuinely, I mean, I've speculated a lot on what causes this, but now it seems media is just absolutely meaningless. It feels like it's a schlock entertainment that's pumped out to
100% agree
anathematize
with
you.
you. My interest in games has been dwindling for years. I don't find really anything that's produced particularly compelling. And I can think of games in the aughts and the early 2010s. There's still some games. You mentioned BioShock. Obviously, it's a mixed bag, but I still have a kind of sentimental attachment to Mass Effect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have any of that these days, and it's just not really appealing. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's really just games have lost their meaning of films. I can think of tons of films from the '90s that I used to, know by heart pretty much all the lines, and they had a particular meaning. I mean, I haven't bothered, or even the early 2000s. I know people will ridicule me. It was one of my favorite films of all time. Is The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. Now say
Mm.
what you want. It's it's to me it's a film, a very beautiful film about homecoming. A man who was tormented by his experiences in the American Civil War. I don't want to give too many spoilers and people have seen it, and he ends up in this strange foreign land of Japan. It's currently sort of arming. It's becoming modern and sort of in the process extinguishing the samurai, and he finds a new place and home. That's I mean, important theme to me, and it had some kind of something to it. Whereas these days, films, I don't know, just I just can't be bothered. I feel nothing.
Mm.
I feel it's like a chore to watch films most of the time, rather than a pleasure, a sort of cerebral pleasure.
Oh
And
yeah.
same with games. Same with games. The same feeling is. I guess I could. Uh, it's very strange, and I don't know if it's simply a consequence of more people are plugged in, and therefore it's its own version of the regression to the mean. When everyone is interested in something, that core, the original qualities that made it special tend to deteriorate and ends up just being sort of this very, very average, kind of gray, formless mass. Could be that. But it's disconcerting even to me because I used to use media to connect to just sort of, personal aspirations or just my sense of hope even, right?
Hmm.
There's nothing in media that gives me that, because I do think that in order to function, you need a sense of something to aspire to look forward to, even if it's, by definition unreachable. Nothing in media gives you that anymore. It's just at best lukewarm, at worst terrible entertainment, and you don't take anything away from it. And I'll bring up, I mean, last time it's maybe I'm the oddball, but there's no journey, right? And that's another important thing. I think that those things that you can see often in older forms of literature and entertainment. There's some journey that you learn from, right? There's nothing like that in modern media, really. It's just, yeah, it's pretty dismal.
I mean, do
Yeah,
we think that
and
this is
boring.
how much we think that this is a product of our brains being modified by the culture we're in, and how much of it this is the media itself just being worse and worse and worse?
Oh, I think it's both. I don't think it's a binary. I think it's both.
Yeah,
We've been
I've noticed that
inundated by it.
reading old books, I still get a lot of edification out of them. The only difference is that it's harder to read books because using social media detracts from your attention span.
Oh, well, I mean, full disclosure, I used to be a fairly prolific reader throughout the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s, and I may still read, but it's embarrassing. I probably read a tenth of what I used to back in the day.
Mhm.
I'm no better. I'm no different. I'm, both a sinner and victim, the purveyor of social media. I produce social media, I guess. It- I, I, I mean, I have a very radical view. People don't like this view, but I have this sense that if I could press a button and just get rid of the internet, I probably would.
Yeah. No,
I mean,
I think Uncle Ted
uh,
had a point. I'll say that. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that on your channel, but I'll throw that out there.
so I didn't quite, I didn't catch what
Oh,
you said
I
actually.
said I think Uncle Ted had a point.
Yeah,
Uncle,
yeah, yeah,
Uncle
yeah,
Ted.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I get it. Yeah. Uh, yeah, in a sense, for sure. I mean, one thing I propose that people think is absurd, but I'm convinced it's probably true, is that so you have this problem of lack of community, lack of social bonds, loneliness, all these things we've been discussing, right? And so along comes the internet. It could be, usually it's Discord, but it doesn't have to be. And it proposed a solution. Well, now you can hang out with people online. You have, a quote unquote World of Warcraft community. And by that I'm saying, and I've said this in videos prior, that community doesn't mean what it used to. Now, what I think the internet does is it creates problems and then offers solutions to the problems it creates, basically. I
Mm,
mean, and so you end up in this vicious circle of, well, you feel isolated and lonely because there's nobody, out in real life. So you connect online and you become addicted because I guess it's better than nothing. It's better to hear a spectral voice someplace and chat with somebody, because everyone is glued to social media anyway. So if you did want to go outside, you wouldn't find anyone in the first place. It's this revolving door, right?
mhm,
And so someone who spent a lot of his formative years without the internet, as somebody who's benefited from the internet as well, I still think that you know yeah, on balance, it's been largely negative. I mean, positive things people bring up about the internet are just poppycock, because when people say, well, think about the knowledge at your fingertips. Well, how many people actually spend time online learning legitimately about subjects, or learning to become a gardener? They don't do that. They're wasting their time and their energy on social media and watching internet historian. I mean, I'm not saying he's a bad guy, but
mhm.
it's just not. Most people aren't using it for these edifying purposes that people claim that they are. So I'm kind of, in a way, I guess I've become a bit of a Luddite. Yeah, I think that it hasn't been all that good. But then again, we're stuck with it, and I'm I'm not really sure. I have to be honest in my ignorance as to a solution to that, because I do think this internet's issue creates problems and then offers solutions to the problems it creates. Um, and I and especially if you're a young person with basically no interest, no real social contacts. I mean, where else are you going to go,
Well, don't you
right?
get the sense that it's burning itself out a little bit?
Can you
I feel
elaborate
like
a little bit?
I feel like the excitement that the internet once generated is completely the romance is
Oh,
completely gone,
oh yes,
and
yes,
I
I agree.
can't.
Yeah.
I think things are gonna basically spring up as alternatives, if for no other reason than that which is what infected will die off, and I know there'll be an
Uh,
evolutionary push. So the two forces I see as happening is, like you were saying, is I think groups of young men in particular coming together, it should be the direction that people like us. That's the direction we should be going, as the remnants of our civilization are concerned. That's what we need to restore things. And then the other direction is going to be our civilization is just going to decay away in large, aside from the pieces of it that are actually supporting themselves, and some foreign force is going to come in and set up shop, and there'll be a new order extending from that, combined with whatever remains of our civilization.
Well, I'm not saying it's not possible, but I mean, I feel as if you're sort of these are sort of long-term projections, which are great, maybe, but again, I'm worried about sort of the current moment and what can be done. And I mean, if it could be there's nothing. It's kind of my view in a way that there's not much that can be done in the current moment.
Well, it seems like
Um,
attitudinally, like that's where we are, right? So, do you know Nick Fuentes? Like, I don't really like Nick Fuentes, but you
I know of him. I don't want to talk. I mean, obviously, YouTube, but yeah, I know of him. Yeah.
okay. So, I mean, he and I really don't get along, but
Hmm.
Nick does find himself in some interesting positions and at the forefront of some interesting phenomenons that are hopeful. Even though I really personally, um, our styles are not very compatible, as you might guess,
Yeah.
and
You
and
seem
one
too
of
nice a person to be compatible.
well, but here's an interesting thing. There was this interaction he had with this conservative blogger called Sydney Watson, who's sort of this normie conservative girl. I'm sure she's very nice, right? But what sort of struck me is that there's this dynamic that kind of popped up that Nick handled it in this really strange way, or a really actually kind of promising way. Is that Sydney Watson tried to shame him because he'd never been in a relationship. And Nick basically just sasses her right back. She says something like, "If you've never been with a woman, how do you know how to deal with a woman?" And Nick says something, "Well, I'm dealing with you right now, aren't I?" And I feel kind of bad for Sydney because she's a very nice girl, I'm sure, and these sort of questions are she's been taught to ask them, right? But they are totally inappropriate questions. Women don't get to gate political conversations behind relationships. If there's a minimum number of relationships a man has to be politically relevant, is there a maximum number of relationships a woman can have for her to become politically irrelevant? Like that's the question, right? So like, I'm sorry she had to catch that backhand, but that backhand needs to occur. This attitude that sort of we gate sort of important conversations about spirituality or moral worth a behind relationships. That needs to just absolutely die on every level. It needs to die in the Christian community. It needs to die in the atheist community. It needs to die in every community that doesn't want to go full on board with whatever idiotic woke phenomenon is going on right now. And even by the logic of the woke community, it should die as well. This is just a complete artifact of sort of what Academic Agent calls the boomer truth regime. And, I've noticed this attitude more and more among young people, and I really try to encourage it as much as possible. If you have no sexual experience, that's a good thing. In many ways, your mind is clear of a lot of stuff that would get in otherwise. And, you should have nothing to be ashamed of for never having a relationship or being a virgin. And in some ways, it's something to be proud about. If you look back towards ancient sources like the Epic of Gilgamesh and other more ancient sources, containing your sexuality and being its master is much more important than just banging some random chick. And I'm really encouraged to see that this ancient attitude is coming back. And to the extent that people try to shame men for not having relationships, this just needs to be kind of dismissed, in my opinion.
I I don't disagree with you, but it seems awfully quixotic, and I don't mean to insult you.
How?
It just well, I I think it's a vanishing small minority that extols the virtues of virginity and sort of pious chastity. I don't really see the the mainstream. Most people are not, especially men, are not thinking along the lines of, well, it's great that I'm inexperienced and that's a good thing. I mean, the cultural mores just don't have set it up such that that's just not the case. Most men who are in that position are yearning, pining away for some kind of experience.
But
I,
that pining away is you allowing other people to have power. I mean, so there's pious, virtuous, like chastity that's very, very difficult. But I'm talking about just sort of the Nick Fuentes fuck. I'm sorry to be profane, but the Nick Fuentes fuck you type of attitude. I mean, like that. I would accept that. I mean, obviously, if you can pull pious chastity off, please do. It's better. But I'm talking about something that's way more mundane than this. I'm just talking about recognizing how
well,
this pining after sexual relationships is a mechanism for control and a mechanism by which society is screwing you over and allowing it to co-opt your own decision making process.
I agree, but here's an example of what I'm talking about. You've heard of the no-fap. It's why did we call everything a movement? It's not a movement.
Yeah,
It's whatever.
yeah. That's the thing. People call
No-fap.
neo-reaction a movement. It's not a movement. It's just
Yeah,
a way of approaching politics.
exactly. People call it MGTOW movement
Yeah,
too, which is very strange. But so the no-fap, I don't know, phenomenon, we'll call it
yeah,
that, right?
yeah. That's a better
Now,
word.
yeah. So you have this no-fap phenomenon, and in a lot of ways, it sort of echoes older attitudes towards masturbation and sort of self-discipline.
Hmm.
But the reality behind it is most of them are doing it, A, because they were porn addicted, but B, they basically want a better sexual experience with a real woman. So they're sort of they're basically want to pursue carnal pleasure,
Mm.
but and so it's sort of a means to an end rather than something else. That's what I mean. Is that everything, even when it does take the form of sort of discipline and rejection of the libidinous, is still sort of redirected towards this primary goal.
Well, you caught me here. I think that's an excellent point. And even in my own recommendations, I realize I'm guilty of this thing. Right, I'm using an emotion of aggression to try to save men from an emotion of craven weakness. And obviously the higher good would just be like super pious and be chaste, not out of anger but out of piety. And the same thing, that the good reason to give up pornography is out of piety and not because you're trying to have a better sexual experience, fornicating, right? And there's this other thing you said that was very true, in your black pill videos. It's true, and at the same time I kind of want to disagree with it. And you said that like how much of like self-improvement is vanity. And so this is sort of like, this is what Christians call pride. And it's sort of a Buddhist concept. It's like when Buddhists try to clear their mind of all thoughts, you try to do this, it's almost impossible, because you clear your mind and then you start thinking about clearing your mind. And then you start thinking about clearing your mind, and so on. It goes back and back and back, right? Um, and human beings have this problem, is that every time you do something good, uh, you you're tempted to do it for a bad reason, and
Mm.
then lean on that new bad reason. And Christians obviously have a very bizarre way, a highly criticized way of dealing with this, where we kind of separate the action from the person in this really radical way that it's been highly criticized by other religions. But the classical wisdom, beyond our explanation of sin or human weakness or failure to achieve nirvana, has always been, okay, well, let's correct the action first, and you have to be on a spiritual mission to try to correct the spirit, but really you can't correct the spirit when the action is ongoing. So you should always prefer to suppress the sinful action if you can possibly manage it, I guess.
Yeah,
Even if you're operating behind the scenes with with a spiritual malevolent intention that will eventually need to be corrected as well, I guess, right? Um, I don't know.
yeah,
That's sort of my reaction. That's a very roundabout way of putting it, but
yeah. Well, I think again in a religious context that makes sense, but for a lot of people, vanity is sort of the beginning and the end of their motivation and reasons for doing things that nominally on the surface appear to be virtuous or good.
For religious people too, like you go to confession and then like you start patting yourself on the back for going to confession, which is like the last thing you should be doing, right? But like you do that, right? Like you can't not do that. Like it's just like this constant struggle in the human mind to get out of this vanity loop. And I don't know, like my religion promises that there's going to be an end to this vanity loop, right? But like I don't know. I've heard of some saints that have been able to abolish this vanity loop, but it's not. Before death, it's certainly a very rare phenomenon, right?
Am I don't want to, because our difference, metaphysical differences, will definitely come to the fore. But I feel, not entirely, obviously, I'm still a human, but I feel I've done, through my own understanding of the universe, a relatively decent job at sort of limiting vanity in myself. I think at times to my
Mm-hmm.
own detriment, because of it really saps the motivation. Um, I but I guess that's what I've observed. That I'm not saying I fully purged myself of vanity, but I don't think of myself as a particularly vain person. Like I think over the years I've it's certainly dwindled quite a bit. I kind of well, I just got to put my cards on the table. I see myself as sort of nothing but the it's a very materialist view of the sort of the byproduct of causes outside of myself.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I can't take responsibility I can't be prideful over the things I do, even if I do them well. Um, but I think that for some reason, and obviously in a religious context, it would have a different interpretation, but people need to feel a sense of pride and vanity in what they do in order to feel it connected to it. Maybe I'll make a good video, maybe I'll have a good I'll say something that seems wise or just observant, but I never feel the inclination to feel particularly attached to that in the sense of, wow, I did a really good job, because I instantly, in my own understanding, view myself as sort of a byproduct of things wholly outside of myself. And so I just, yeah, it just doesn't occur to me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not, I actually see, in theory, potentially a bit of overlap between that and maybe a religious view where man is small compared to the majesty of God. I'm not saying
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is
It almost
identical.
feels Calvinist in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah. But I've definitely, as I've gone through this journey over the many years, just realized that it has sapped my productivity. So I think there's some quality to human beings, and I'm obviously speaking as an irreligious person, whereby they just need a sense of pride and vanity to feel connected to the things that they're doing, so they can pursue them. And if you strip them of that, um, yeah, you end up with kind of a bit of an empty shell and somebody who's not particularly motivated. So maybe it's the case that I think pride is, I'm not a religious, but is kind of sinful. It's not good to be prideful, because I think it first off, one thing it does is destroys compassion. I think that's the biggest issue.
Yeah,
Um,
that's our generation. Our narcissism is making us malicious.
yeah, yeah, but also it doesn't really make sense for reasons to my view. But maybe you need a little bit of to keep you sort of chugging along. Maybe the best case scenario is a kind of a tug of war between the innate vanity one might feel and also the realization that it's not a good quality to have. So when you are getting too big for your breeches, you basically acknowledge it. You accuse yourself of doing that, and then you shrink back in, so as to retain some degree of humility. I'm not sure, but it seems to me, as you're describing, maybe in a Catholic context, this process of even going to confession, feeling prideful, that it might be a push and pull that is somehow necessary to function and as an authentic human being.
Yeah,
Because I mean, I might make no secret, I really struggle with motivation, for a variety of reasons. But one big reason, I don't feel it really as an individual, as I don't really feel as that I'm an agent attached to things in a lot of ways, which I guess I think you're correct, is kind of a Calvinist view of things, albeit an irreligious one. Yeah.
well, I mean, you know, I'll grant this. We'll probably have to table this before, but I was remiss to say that in edge cases, at least, Buddhism and Christianity have noticed that people who obtain this kind of sainthood, when they truly leave all their vanities by the side, they become hyper motivated. Now, I'm not saying that like this is always like a tall order. Can you become like a Buddha or a living saint or something like that? That's I don't know if that's really what we're discussing right here, so we'll table it. But I think that if you go to these classical traditions, they postulate this higher escape from vanity that uncovers that it uncovers motivation rather than obscuring it. And so I just want to put that possibility out there because I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that being the case in I don't know about Islam, but certainly in the Buddhist and Christian tradition, that's always been the description of saints or Buddhas. Is the Buddhist says before enlightenment, chop wood carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood carry water.
Yeah, no, I've looked into. I mean, I think I'm actually of any religious tradition, I feel most wedded to the Buddhist one for reasons, the fourfold truth and things of that nature. The general observation of sort of the evanescence of life and things like that. I feel pretty wedded to that. But yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a saint. But when I do feel motivated, it's usually to motivated to help other people. I don't feel very motivated to do very much with myself, to be perfectly honest. That just seems like something I drag my feet around, but I have to do it maybe in part in order to help other people. Because if I'm not, if I just let myself completely go, I'm not in a position to help other people. But
Do you think
I,
that might be a
you know,
way out of the situation we're in? If we could,
mm,
if things got bad,
mm.
people might need mutual aid societies. And that would implicitly be an opportunity for a lot of these young men to find purpose outside of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for. I mean, it's rewarding, but there's something sincere and I don't want to say it's pure, it's because it doesn't have to be, and sometimes it's not, but something just decent about helping somebody else and you not really benefiting from it in any direct way. It's certainly possible. But you mentioned earlier, the narcissism of small differences and very large differences, and that's the case with progressives. This is really, I think, what thing that bothers me the most of it is that we've really lost our ability to just view each other as human beings. And I do this too sometimes. I mean, if I'm in an environment where I start hearing progressive talking points, I'm usually silent and I'm rolling my eyes, and I either want to leave or I'm just thinking this is just cringe or whatever, right? I just because I've heard it so often,
Mm-hmm.
maybe partly that, but I, I I'm that's the thing I really want to know is it would it be possible to get past all this stuff? I think with the internet it makes it very, very difficult.
You mean
I think
past
prior to that,
progressivism?
no, well, past the narcissism of small and large differences.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's going to be really hard to get along with a progressive who has, fundamentally different views of reality and their place in it. But in theory, we're all human beings, right? So we should be able to have some common ground. Um, I think also when it comes to it's a very strange view I find in progressive circles when it comes to sort of egalitarianism. I'm certainly not one. I mean, just you
Mm.
look at reality and there's nothing egalitarian about it. But I guess it's more of an ideal than anything else. But this idea that if you give up egalitarianism, you somehow the default position from that is you withhold compassion for people, which is strange to me. It doesn't make any sense. I'd argue that once you give that up, you're more inclined to feel compassion, to want to help and aid, because you realize precisely that unfortunately there are hierarchies, and sometimes people really have terrible luck and don't end up in a good position in the hierarchy, and you'd be more inclined to help them rather than just claiming that no such hierarchy exists in the first place, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, noblesse oblige. I think
Yeah,
that what
yeah.
progressives are worried about, the reason why there's no progressive noblesse oblige, is that progressives, I mean, noblesse oblige really requires a moral and geographic community of commonality. And what progressives are very worried about is that if we say goodbye to egalitarianism, people are going to go back to living in insular tribes, which they probably will. That probably will be part of the solution, right? I think that there is, when it comes to difference, you're definitely going to get a lot of compassion from the high to the low, but you're not going to get a lot of compassion across moral communities. I don't know how that would even occur. I'm not. I'm not. It's just. It's because the collective dimension of politics just looms too high, and politics is the ultimate death of compassion in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And this is why progressives who whine endlessly about compassion and empathy are never empathetic to people who are ideologically not progressive, be they right wingers or MRAs or what have you, right?
I mean,
They're never
yeah.
compassionate, and MRAs are not right wing, in my opinion.
No.
There are a variety in my worldview. There are a variety of left winger, but they're complete. There's no empathy paid towards them whatsoever, because they've stepped out, or turfs. That's the new out group, right? There's no empathy for turfs or any of these out ideological groups in the progressive circle. The concept of empathy is a completely internal one, and it's made all the worse because they don't realize that. And I don't know. I'm not saying that individual humans can't have moments of empathy for people outside the moral group of consideration. But that's what's naturally going to happen is people are going to gravitate towards groups that of people that have common values and common worldviews, and inside
Yeah.
those groups, empathy might be able to reignite.
Yeah. Well, hmm. That's not very encouraging. I mean, I agree with you,
I
unfortunately.
think it might happen though, right? I mean, I don't know. Do you think it's so far fetched?
Uh, I'm just a lot less hopeful than you are, it seems, which I hope I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, what do you
I,
think is going to happen? I mean, like society is falling apart, right? I mean,
oh yeah, I think it's absolutely falling apart. But well, I mean, I just don't, I just can't, for my own self, as an individual, I can't find some vision whereby these things improve. It seems to me, and I mean, you're a very nice guy, very decent person, I can tell, and I like talking to you, but I, I feel almost as if you're in the most admirable and hopeful way, kind of grasping at straws for a future where things actually become better.
hmm.
And maybe you're right. Maybe they will, X or Y or Z will happen, but I maybe I'm blind to it because I'm not religious. I don't know, but I don't see anything on the horizon that's gonna. I see things getting worse and worse and worse, and
But you agree that the past had some elements that were better, right? So in
yeah,
order to
sure.
believe that the past could be better and the future couldn't be, you'd have to stipulate some force in history that only went one direction, I guess. And actually,
I
I do
suppose
believe
so.
there's a force like that in history. But
Mm.
that's I don't know of I think that
Well,
we might want to understand what is this force that allows 1989 to be better than 2029, but not 2049 to be better than 2029. You know what I mean?
well, I think let's qualify it. I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, if you look at history, obviously it isn't sort of unidirectional necessarily. But I think the difficulty now is we're trying to play this game of predictions, and we're not clairvoyants. Anyone, no
Mm.
one really is, and so we're sort of chucking darts and at various things and saying, well, maybe this will happen, maybe this will happen. I'm saying basically from my vantage point at the moment, the next couple of decades seem very grim indeed. Um, increasingly bereft of meaning. All these horrible,
Yeah.
and the material level, there'll be more crime. There'll be horrible things happening to people. At the spiritual level, if we wish to describe it this way, more depression, more isolation. Um, so I'm saying within the next couple of decades, I don't see any improvement. Now there could 100, 200, 300, sure, it's possible, but that's beyond my own abilities to really envision. And maybe I'm just reluctant to take a stab at what will happen after that. Um,
We're in for a wild next 2 decades. No disagreement there, right? But
yeah, and so it brings to mind, what did I mean? Obviously, we're kind of in a position, quote unquote, privileged position, given our technologies. We can talk about it and think about this. What a person. You mentioned the Bronze Age collapse. I mean,
mhm.
if you had gone through that, you were in, say, the century. I mean, the recovery after the Bronze Age collapse was a bit variable. Some places recovered out, a mere century after, some a couple. But I mean, you were in that post-collapse civilization. What did you actually think? Or, I mean, you
I
were,
prefer the fall of Rome to the Bronze Age collapse because I
yeah,
have no. There's just so little sources to the Bronze Age collapse. Whereas
yeah. Well,
you
sure.
can
Why
actually
not?
read like Boethius or Augustine and see what people were
Yeah,
thinking during the fall of the Roman Empire, right?
absolutely. So, look at something like, I don't know, fourth, fifth century Rome.
Mm,
Um, I mean, what the common person was thinking, we didn't have access to that. But yeah, there are some authors we can look at, and I just think that that also must have just seemed pretty awful, albeit for slightly different reasons. How, I mean, it is getting late where I am, so I'm
yeah.
gonna somewhat want to wrap this up in the not too distant future. But I mean, what would be your antidotes I mean, obviously as a religious Catholic person, for somehow weathering the storm, which I think we both agree is going to last decades. It's not going to end tomorrow or the day after, or even 10 years from now. It's going to be really, really hard on a lot of people. And unfortunately, I think it's the people without religious connection, without spiritual connection, without community who are going to suffer the most. And we're going to lose a lot of people, I think, to their own hand, unfortunately, in this process. And I mean, again, it sounds strange, and the people, fedora tippers. I sincerely wish more people could find some kind of religious purpose, uh, because uh, what else is there right now? There's got. We started this conversation talking about sort of purpose and telos, and
Mhm.
that's just really lacking. And if we're going to be stuck with this, I mean, if basically for the rest of our lives until our deathbeds, we as individuals, this is the current reality, this meta that we're talking about. Ah, I'm just very invested in trying to figure out a way of weathering that as well as possible, and particularly for the younger people, because presumably they have even more time. And we talked about they've missed out on crucial opportunities that we had just because we were older.
Yeah.
In addition to that, crucial experiences. For all my corruption and despair, I still feel like I had things in my life that were formative, and um, yeah, just by dint of my age, and I, I don't, I just so desperately wish I could impart that, or I mean, impart, just hope, somehow just conjure out of thin air, something similar for young people, young men in particular. Because yeah, it is going to be a long, long winter, as it were, and I. But even
But
even that, I mean, sorry, if I just
go
might
go ahead,
finish
go
this
ahead, go ahead.
thought. Um, we are somewhat anomalous, even though I'm not, technically on the right. In thinking we're living in dark times. I mean,
Mhm.
most people, particularly progressives, don't have that vision, or normies. I mean, I know tons of normies. They're not really religious, and they think everything is fine. Sort of, at least.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that this is what's I think the PMC is starting to kind of very slowly catch on the things. I mean, you actually said this, and this is what kind of really hooked me on one of your videos. You said that I don't know if you used the professional managerial class, but you said that the most notable thing about this last year is that increasingly, maybe you said the normies, that they're understanding that things aren't going great.
mhm,
But I think that the unfortunate thing is that by the time they realize this, they'll be out of power. So that they're going to be joining us in dealing with the problem of sorting through the ashes rather than in any position to turn the train around.
Well, at the very least, and if that's the case, then maybe there'll be more manpower to help, I don't know, if recover the, I don't know, recover the corpses and whatever else you can recover as you're sifting through the ashes. I
Well,
don't know.
I think that what we again, sources are sparse, but when you see people in these times, they their hope and their spirituality comes from small things. The macrocosmic situation, like everybody in our generation has been trained to look at hope, a hope that looks like Martin Luther King, a mass political movement, a sea change. There's all these stupid children's entertainment, and there's this one song I hate that comes up on the mix that my sometimes watches, where all of the characters are singing about making the world a better place.
Yeah,
This makes me
right.
this makes me sick because it's just all progressive propaganda, and like the idea is like we're gonna wake up tomorrow and then like manifestly through our own will every place in the world is gonna be better than the day it was before. Oh man, this is just this is not a healthy
That's
approach.
toxic.
Yeah,
It's toxic.
it's you're training people to, when they don't see that materialize because it's not materializing, you're essentially training children into learned helplessness and into a false hope that will ward them away from real hope. But it's similar, right? You know the Roman Empire claimed it was forever, and when it fell apart, people who their religion wasn't really like Jupiter or Jove or Janus or any of these Roman gods, although there were some other kind of mystery cults going around at that time. That wasn't the pagan religion of Rome. The pagan religion of Rome was, Rome will civilize the world and it will last forever, and then suddenly it didn't, right? And so what people do, it seems, is that they find edification in small places, and you can simultaneously understand that the world is falling around. The world might be falling around you macrocosmically, but you could build a church, and this church could have a holiness in it that it is more holy or more special or more meaningful than anything that existed in the empire when it was at its supposed prime, say in the reign of the Hadrian emperors or something like that, or the Flavian
Yeah.
emperors. I'm sorry.
hmm No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's this idea of sort of forging a community, if one can, finding meaning in that, despite basically the world around you collapsing. Yeah, and I think that maybe something like that could be possible. Maybe, but it's very difficult. But I agree with you. It's you're gonna have to focus. People will have to focus on little things. But even as you say that, I mean, as we all know, as we're all plugged into social media has this tendency to draw us away from the little things and focus on these
Oh,
macroscopic pictures, and that's what really gets you, quote unquote, black pill. That's what gets you depressed. That's what really sucks you down that eddy of despair. And yeah, I mean, it's easier said than done. Don't use social media, I guess, but
yeah, I don't know
uh,
what to say to that because I almost feel bad being a social media content creator because I understand how toxic social media is. Uh,
yeah.
there's got to be a responsible way to use this stuff. I don't have all the answers, but that has to be the new spiritual task, is to develop boundaries to this technology we've invented.
I I think that's an ideal one should strive for. I just don't have a freaking clue how you would. I mean, how you go about it. That's all, and I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a
Uh,
tough question, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I create social media too, and I don't. I mean, I often feel misconstrued and misunderstood by my own subscribers, but I certainly don't want to hurt people. Quite the opposite. But I don't know. I don't know what the. I mean, I'd like. yeah, I'd like there for be a way to sort of use social media responsibly, and I mean, in some sense there is, I mean, there might be some, I don't know, PBS, and they talk about the dinosaurs. I mean, that's kind of cool, I guess. But that's that has a limited purview, and it's not really the focus of things we talk about. So there's the educational aspect, which I still think can be good, provided it's free from the current ideology, which it often is in the right context. But beyond that, I'm not so sure. But I really think for people who are religious or Catholic or some kind of, I do think there are options there. Find, if you can, find people of like mind. Try to reach out and take, as bad as the internet has been, take advantage of that. I mean, find people of like mind if they're spiritual or co-religionists, and if you meet people online, then try to meet them offline as well. And maybe, try to meet more people and then create some kind of community if you can, if possible. I think I've observed this in well, actually in certain Catholic circles. Um, and I think that it definitely can be of a benefit if provided you have the requisite religious belief, which isn't always a given. But
I think that
um,
people can, I don't think you necessarily need to be hard religious to pursue something like this. I think you just have to be you just have to say to yourself, well, I'm going to pursue meaning or edification. I think vague I like using a very broad definition of religion, and I think having a vague understanding of religion is a perfectly fine starting point. Like just a vague understanding of providence or ultimate truth or ultimate meaning in sort of the Einsteinian sense. Like I think you can work with that, but I think you have to have a religion that essentially centers meaning and purpose above pleasure, because I don't think that we're going to be able to compete with the pleasure machine, the Skinner box that is
mm,
modern social media. So
yeah,
if your religion doesn't trump pleasure, it's got to be that. And the second thing is that your religion has to be at least bigger than politics.
yeah,
Obviously, I don't think there's any such thing as a non-political religion, but your religion has to be happy never dealing with politics and just ignoring that for a time if need be. It can't be something like that those idiotic progressive PBS shows where all the Muppets sit and sing about making the world a better place and they're 5 years old. Like that feeling is it's just a lie. That's that kind of political movement where you just stand up to a protest and suddenly some hard political problem is solved and you're heroes. That's just that was always a lie. It was never true.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah. As I said, it is fairly late where I am, and you're here in the old world.
Yeah.
So, but it was really good talking to you. I enjoyed it.
Yes, definitely.
Um, I'll, you'll upload on your channel. So I don't know how much overlap there is between yourselves, but assume there might be a little bit, but just in case, each YouTuber will upload on his respective channel.
We'll link each
And
other.
yes,
Maybe we
indeed.
can share audio recordings because I don't know how my audio recording came out, but
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. Yeah. You can, if something goes awry, you can let me know. But
okay.
yeah. Thank you for the conversation, audience. Thank you for tuning in.
And thank you very much for
And
having me too.
oh yeah, it was my pleasure. And take care.
All right, take care.